Blubrry Advertising Partner Program, Soundcloud for Sale, and Pokemon Go metrics. Welcome to episode 12 of the Richard Daly podcast, where I bring you a UK perspective on the latest news and developments from the world of podcasting and internet radio. Straight into the news this week for anyone who hosts their podcast with Blubrry. On the latest PowerPress podcast, Blubrry discussed their new Priority Advertising Partner Program. The aim of the program is to provide new ways for podcasters hosting with Blubrry to monetize their shows. Now, one of the biggest goals of the Priority Advertising Program is to simplify the process of connecting podcasters and advertisers. And Blubrry are looking to match advertisers with several suitable shows that they can bundle together in a package and then offer those to advertisers and media buyers. It's expected that most of the campaigns will be host endorsed, which I think means that they'll be read from scripts and will require sponsor mentions with trackable URL links in the show notes for each episode. Blubrry are keen to point out that podcasters with smaller audiences will be able to take advantage of the program as well, though of course those people are going to need to temper their expectations of income because the payments are mostly going to be based on the number of listeners. But still, if you are a Blubrry hosted podcast, well worth checking out their new partner program. Bloomberg this week report that Soundcloud may be looking for a buyer. Soundcloud's owners are considering a sale that would value the German music streaming company at about $1 billion. And Soundcloud's challenge over the last couple of years has been to continue to grow its user base while also looking to move into profit. Now, this £1 million valuation, this seems like a challenge to me. It does seem like a really high valuation. Soundcloud have got about 175 million registered users and made a loss of 39 million euros in 2014, which was the last year that they've published figures for. They launched their paid Go music service back in about March, which could be seen, I guess, as trying to compete with the likes of Spotify. Now, it's not been a big success. There have been lots of complaints, I understand, about the user interface, as well as lack of content. And even the big investment from Twitter earlier this year doesn't seem to have helped. Now, I suspect the price is going to have to come down before a sale is made. So watch this space on that one. By the way, this podcast is now available on SoundCloud, as well as all the usual places such as iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, and even YouTube. So if you are a SoundCloud user, do check me out there. You can find me at Richard Daly. James Cridland, the radio futurologist, who I mention quite often on the podcast, has published a short audio piece this week on his YouTube channel. The piece is called Podcast Stats, What We Don't Know. And there's a subtitle as well. That's Does Podcasting Have a Data Problem? James discusses that podcasting is now big business, but that monetization for podcasting is harder than for radio. Now, he says the reason for this is that good listening measurements aren't available. Now, James goes on to talk about how he was surprised by statistics that say that most people listen to podcasts on demand rather than by subscribing through services such as iTunes. Now, this article is an interesting piece on how download statistics could be made available, but I do think that some people have misinterpreted James' thoughts on this. In fact, James says in his newsletter that a snarky comment from a podcaster led him to investigate this topic more. Now, I really hope that wasn't me. Sorry, James, if it was. James's research into this topic does seem to have surprised him a little, as he's actually found that there are quite a lot of useful statistics available at the macro level for podcasting. And I believe he does see benefits for individual podcast creators in having better metrics, certainly around listening habits, as this will help to improve the content of people's shows and make better decisions on which platforms they should promote their shows on. Now, I have to confess, I love my metrics. Now, I host this podcast on Libsyn, and I am obsessed by the level of detail I can get about my show statistics. Now, like what, you might say? Well, maybe the most useful I'm finding right now is which pages on my website people are clicking to get to my podcast players or links. Now, I doubt this info would really be of any interest to an advertiser, but it is helping me understand which content I need to focus on. And it's really interesting the pages that people are visiting and then clicking on podcast players. Quite surprising, really, where they find me. Now, in terms of a point James makes about not knowing how much of a podcast episode someone who downloads a podcast file actually listens to. Well, interestingly, I can see this information about my radio show recordings that I put on Mixcloud. And to be honest, I find this quite depressing, as early dropouts in the shows are quite common. Now, I guess that says something about my radio shows rather than metrics overall. So, do I think these metrics are important to have? Well, I suspect that for some podcasters they will be, but others, they just don't need this level of detail. My feeling is that we're going to see a split in the industry over time, with the bigger podcast companies and networks heading for platforms that are going to provide playback metrics, while the vast majority of independent podcasters are going to stay with the simple download options from the likes of iTunes. Journalism.co.uk's 17th News Rewired conference took place last week in London. The opening keynote was presented by Kristen Taylor. She's the audience development specialist and community editor for the second season of Serial, the award-winning podcast phenomenon. Taylor discussed the value for publishers in interacting with their communities and presented on how the Serial podcast engages with their online community. Taylor said that podcasters' traditional focus tends to be on statistics for audience feedback. No surprise there. But there are innovative ways that podcasters should be and can engage with their online communities. Some of the tips she gave for engaging with an audience included using Tumblr. Tumblr is a platform that allows good interaction, and also it has an anonymous nature for comments, which some audience members seem to like. She suggests not just looking at the numbers, but spending time researching the demographics, interests and online personas of avid consumers of your content. And also to look at the people who dislike your content and try to understand what's causing them not to like your show. The last point that she came up with was around Google Trends. She suggested searching Google Trends to see the top questions being asked about your topic, which seems like great advice to me. A brief mention now of a blog post from email marketing company Aweber. This is titled Podcasting and Email Marketing, A Tale of Two Mediums. If you do any kind of email marketing for your podcast, or even are just thinking about starting it, then I urge you to head over to the Aweber blog to read this article in full. I'll put a link in the show notes, which of course you can find at richarddally.com/12. Now, you don't need to be an Aweber customer to get a lot from this article. Basically, the article describes how similar podcasting and email marketing are, and how the techniques used for both cross over. I guess a good example would be when we send an email to our marketing list, we try to make it sound personal. And this is typically, of course, the same on a podcast, speaking to an individual rather than the whole audience. Now, for the cost of your email address from Aweber, you can download a guide and 5-part course for podcasters to learn everything they need to know about email marketing. A little light relief now, courtesy of the BBC Online News magazine. Should you believe those Pokemon Go download numbers? Now, this BBC article asks how reliable are the numbers in the news that tell you how many times the app has been downloaded. Figures of up to 15 million downloads in the first week of release have been quoted in US news reports. But where does this number come from? We know that Apple and Google don't release figures for downloads, but Apple did confirm that Pokemon Go had broken the App Store record for downloads in the first week of release. Now, of course, the developers of the app also know how many downloads there have been, but they aren't releasing the data either. So the BBC went out and did some research, and they spoke to SurveyMonkey Intelligence, which are a company that's been trying to work out how many people have really downloaded Pokemon Go. Now, it turns out the numbers come from a collection of estimates, including numbers of users and App Store rankings. And these estimates are probably as good as political polls, and of course everyone in the UK knows how accurate or not those can be. Anyway, enough of that. I just wanted to bring this one up because it just goes to show that it's not just podcasts that have challenges with metrics. Time now for the regular feature here on the podcast, where I talk a little about the podcast or podcasts that I've added to my own listening feed this week. My recommendation this week is a podcast called Building Nextcast. Nextcast is spelled Nexcast. Building Nextcast follows a company on their journey towards building a podcast app and platform called Nextcast. And the show is hosted by Nextcast CEO Brian Sanders. From a user's perspective, the Nextcast app is designed to be a powerful podcast player that will include additional interactive features such as being able to watch videos, see images, read more about the podcast and connect with the hosts and guests. So far, 4 episodes of the show have been published. The style is very similar to the Startup podcast from Gimlet Media, and the host Brian is quick to recognise Startup as an inspiration for recording the journey of the company. I think there's something here in this podcast for all podcasters to learn from. Brian discusses the challenges of starting a new business, and he gets some great advice and feedback from potential investors on his plans. I really recommend this show. It is polished and it tells a really interesting story. You can find out more about the podcast and app at buildingnextcast.com. Remember, no N. So events time. Where can you meet up with me? I will be at James Cridland's Next Radio Conference on the 19th of September in London. Next Radio is a conference for people who make great audio, and there are going to be more than 20 sessions sharing the best new radio ideas. James says that attendees come from the BBC, commercial radio stations, independent production companies and podcasters. Next Radio is now the UK's biggest radio conference. Tickets are only £149 plus VAT, so it is pretty affordable too. A link in the show notes to the conference website, richarddaly.com/12. If you are attending, do let me know. Let's meet up over a coffee or during lunch. Tweet me at Richard Daly or email richard@richarddaly.com. Okay, so that's all from the Richard Daly podcast for this week. If you visit my website at richarddaly.com, you'll find all my social media links, as well as the various ways you can subscribe to this show. The show notes for the episode are at richarddaly.com/12. Do send me your questions or comments. And of course, if there is a topic you'd like me to cover, then do tweet me. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.